House Bill 6 by Representative Muscarella. It's an act to amend Title 15 and 44 relative to the execution of a death sentence to provide for the methods of execution, to provide for the confidentiality of records or information relating to the execution of a death sentence.
Senator Kleinpate, on your bill.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. President, members. Today, I bring you House Bill 6. This bill does two things. It declares that any records or information pertaining to the purchase, providing, and manufacturing of drugs related to the death penalty shall be strictly confidential and not subject to public disclosure. Second, the methods of execution shall be lethal injection, nitrogen hypoxia, and electrocution. The current problem that we face is that we have 57 inmates awaiting execution, yet there's two obstacles in the way bringing these horrific chapters to a close. The first relates to our current death penalty laws. Right now, these laws require that the Department of Public Safety and Corrections to carry out all executions by lethal injection only. Unfortunately, due to the nature of public records, both compounding pharmacies and pharmaceutical companies have refused to sell or even prepare the drugs needed for this execution by lethal injection. Even though manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacists would be legally and lawfully providing the necessary products, the fear of their identities becoming public scares them from giving us the drugs. Through our proposed legislation, we intend to keep our word to the victims of these awful crimes and deliver the swift and certain justice that they were promised so long ago. Louisiana law should not allow anyone under a sentence of death to have their sentence delayed for such an unreasonable amount of time. Our legislation will remedy this delay moving forward and ensure the scales are finally balanced. I have an offer I'd like to offer up, amendment I'd like to offer up.
Amendments sent up by Senator Kleinpeter. They are set number 355. 355.
Members, there was an amendment added on the House floor by Representative Landry. We're accepting of those amendments. There was a little bit of questioning on it, and with this amendment, what it's going to do is, I'll read out: the entity responsible for maintaining records or information pertaining to the provision of drugs, medical supplies, or medical equipment for execution purposes shall disclose the information to the State Inspector General. The State Inspector General shall conduct a review of the disclosed information to ensure compliance with the provisions of paragraph 2 of this subsection. Upon completion of the review, the State Inspector General shall return the disclosed information and issue a certification stating whether the purchase of drugs, medical supplies, or medical equipment procured for the purpose of carrying out executions complies with paragraph 2 of this subsection. The certification shall also state whether the drugs, medical supplies, or medical equipment were procured from an individual, business, medical equipment, business, organization, or entity possessing license pursuant to the laws of their respective state to engage in such activities and affirming the validity of the license. The certification shall be a public record but shall not disclose any of the information protected by RS 15570.
Okay, Senator Kleinpeter has offered an amendment to House Bill 6. Are there any questions? See no questions. Are there any objections to the adoption of the amendment? See no objection. Amendment is adopted. Next amendment.
Next amendment is by Senator Duplessis. It's set number 356, 356.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I want to be crystal clear on my position as it relates to this legislation and the death penalty. I am vehemently opposed to state-sanctioned execution in all forms, in every method. But I'm offering up this particular amendment, which will strike the use of basically using gas as a method of execution. Because while every method of execution, I believe, is a form of torture, this one stands out. This one stands out for many in our community. It evokes incredibly deep pain. As we know, this method was used to kill millions by Nazi Germany, and to use an untested, unproven method to take the life of someone in this way is something that, while I would never support this bill, even if this amendment were to pass, I want to speak on behalf of many in my community and many in our communities who believe that this method, in particular, of using lethal gas is just simply unacceptable, and it is another form of torture that I don't think any of us should be a part of. So this amendment would strike that method from this bill.
Members, Senator Duplessis has offered an amendment to House Bill 6. I see no questions. Are there any objections? Senator Klein-Peter objects. On your objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Duplessis, with all due respect, this method is approved in other states. It is not deemed unconstitutional, and until they deem this method unconstitutional, I would like to keep the bill in its proper posture.
Senator Duplessis to close on your amendment. He waives his closing. Member Senator Duplessis has offered an amendment to House Bill 6, which Senator Klein-Peter has objected. When the clerk opens the machines, all those in favor of the amendment will vote yes. All the opposed will vote no. Madam Clerk, please, Secretary, please open the machines. Vote your machines. Senator Jackson Andrews, yes. Secretary will close the machines, 15 yeas and 22 nays, and the amendment failed to be adopted. Next amendment.
No further amendments.
No further amendments. Senator Duplessis for the floor on the bill.
Members, I know this is a difficult one for everybody. This is never an easy one. I want to just begin by talking about the victims, and that my heart breaks for every victim, every family member who's had to experience the loss or the pain of a loved one, to even have to go through the process of being confronted with someone who's committed such a heinous act. But I also want to talk about those victims who don't support the death penalty, which there are many. What about those victims? This is not as clear-cut as some may want it to be. There are many victims who don't believe that the state has the right or that this is any form of justice. I've never personally believed that the death penalty honors victims. It honors vengeance. And the Bible teaches us that vengeance does not belong to us. We know that the death penalty is ineffective because it's not a deterrent. We know that it's inefficient because it's incredibly costly, and it brings families through years and years of pain, and we know that it's awfully inhumane. It is inefficient, it's ineffective, and it's inhumane. But, you know, if you know how you're going to vote, if it doesn't appeal to your moral conscience, at least let's apply some common sense. In a few minutes, we're going to debate a bill dealing with the issue of post-conviction. Post-conviction. We have an entire process in our legal system dedicated to appeals and post-conviction. That's a clear acknowledgement by this body and the law that it's an imperfect system, that the system is flawed, and we give people an opportunity who've been convicted to petition for their innocence. I think since 1989, the state of Louisiana has exonerated over 70 people. But we would go down the path of something as final as putting someone to death when we know we have an imperfect system. I don't believe it gives anybody closure. I don't believe it brings anybody peace. But that's just my belief. Obviously, many feel differently. I think we can do better. I think the death penalty is one of the biggest stains on us as a society. And to continue to revive and expand it, I think only brings us in the wrong direction. I don't see how we can pray to a God that we can't trust in his fate, his covering of bringing that justice. For those reasons, I oppose this bill, and I ask that if you are still thinking about where you stand on this issue, that you also oppose this bill. Thank you.
Senator Barrow for the floor on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I spent a lot of time and been in a lot of prayer, have sought counsel for many of my pastors as we have been deliberating issues during this session. But of all the bills that we have, I think that this probably, for me, is one of the most inhumane bills that we have. I don't want to repeat a lot of what my colleague has said because I think he really stated it very well. But I do want to highlight a few things. And before I do want to acknowledge the victims that came before our committee and stated how they felt. And one family I know has been going through this journey for more than 29 years. And I cannot imagine what that feels like. But then there were others who came to the table who were victims who stated that while they were in a lot of pain, they didn't feel like this would actually make them feel any better or really bring them any closer to closure. What they really spoke about was forgiveness and how they could help those individuals who had actually caused pain to their family. I'm reminded of Senator Cologne. Many of you may remember her and what her family went through. And I called her because I couldn't remember exactly what she stated when we were in committee a couple of years ago when this issue came up. And she told me that she was not in favor, nor was her husband, after their daughter was brutally killed. Of the death penalty. I've been thinking long and hard and about a lot of things. It's a lot to consider. The death penalty is already law here in the state of Louisiana. It's just, how do you really execute and how you do that, right? And honestly, everything that's been proposed really is very inhumane. One of the things that happened before we closed our committee the other day was the general counsel who served back in the 90s. She came, and I thought that she provided the most relevant testimony that we heard. And she said that when they were providing and doing the executions, the one thing that they ensured was to make sure that they crossed every T and dotted every I so that they were not botched, so that it was done correctly. And at the end of the day, they knew that they had done their best job. And she said to us, as we go down this road, to make sure that we do that, she told us to take our time. She said, the execution chair is downstairs. She said, is that what you want to go back to? I thought that her words was great words of counsel. And as I get ready to take my seat, I thought about this. You know, we tried to put some language in the bill that I think that would try to make some of us feel better about the individuals who have to carry this out, the workers, the employees. And I don't think there is nothing that we can prepare those individuals for. I'm reminded of the Green Mile. Y'all remember Tom Hanks in that movie? And his punishment was to live a long time. The individuals who even think they may be prepared to do this will learn that they're not. And to see someone repeatedly being executed cannot prepare the mental psyche. I am pro-life. When I got elected over 18 years ago, I was pro-life. And my statement has always been, I'm pro-life from the womb to the tomb. I don't think that God has given us that authority or the ability to determine when and how life is to be executed. And with that, Mr. President and members of this distinguished body, I would ask you to really dig deep and to consider your vote on this issue. And I want you to know that I oppose it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Barrow. Senator Carter for the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, members. We've heard a lot about the Constitution throughout the course of this special session. Let me read to you the 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution. It provides, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. That's our Constitution. Many years ago in 1972, in Farman versus Georgia, the United States Supreme Court considered, it is assumed that in our decisions, speaking of prior decisions of the Supreme Court, that punishment by death is not cruel unless the manner of execution can be said to be inhumane and barbarous. And that is what we're discussing today. Whether or not the manner of execution can be said to be inhumane or barbarous. But the Supreme Court also continues and says, it is also said in our opinions that the prescription of cruel and unusual punishments is not fastened to the obsolete, but may acquire meaning as public opinion becomes enlightened by human justice. And here's how the Supreme Court finishes. It would seem to be incontestable that the death penalty inflicted on one defendant is unusual if it discriminates against him by reason of his race, religion, wealth, social position, or class. It would be unusual and cruel to subject one defendant to the death penalty in a disproportionately discriminatory manner. And way back when, in 1972, the United States Supreme Court found evidence that the death penalty was disproportionately assigned to those who were African American, those who were poor, those who were of other minority groups. The Supreme Court found it a racist practice. It was discriminatory. It was deemed unconstitutional. Not just whether or not the method the state goes about carrying out an execution, but the manner by which it is imposed. Since then, that's 1972, many states have enacted laws to figure out what's a humane way to try to carry out the death penalty. They're yet to find one. And many of them had tried to enact practices that try to address the discriminatory effect that the death penalty is imposed. Louisiana, that's not part of the call. We can't address that. And if you look at the current numbers that we have on death row here in Louisiana, it shows evidence that is being assessed in a discriminatory manner. We know because we just left the redistricting session that African Americans make up a third of the state, but yet we represent 2/3 of those who are on death row. Do you know the number? There's way too many homicides in my city, my parish, the parishes I represent in the great state of Louisiana, in our nation. There's a small amount of people on death row. How do they determine who is it that serves on death row and who is it that just gets to live out their life in jail? You know what's the number one indicator? The number one statistic? The race of the accused and the race of the victim. If it's an African American accused of killing a white person, that person is exceptionally more likely to get the death penalty. That is unconstitutional. That is cruel. That is unusual. I urge you all to vote against this. This is a bad bill. This is unconstitutional. And if you can't vote against it, I urge the federal courts, if you're listening, strike this law down. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Carter. Senator Boudreaux for the floor on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I rise in opposition. I stand today as a practicing Catholic. I've fallen short in my attempts to lead and serve from a religious standpoint, from the teachings of the Bible. Today, this goes against those very teachings. Now, you've heard a lot, you know a lot. We've gotten a lot of calls, a lot of letters. And let me just take a minute to share with you because it's heavy on my heart. Not as a Democrat, and it shouldn't be as a Republican, but it should be about someone who understands when we pass bills, the impact. And what does it say? What does it say for the state of Louisiana? So the Louisiana Conference of Catholic Bishops respectfully opposes HB 6. And they ask for our consideration of the following. And first and foremost, we're in a crime session. We never forget the victims. We never take it lightly. But the Catholic Church says we are to continue to pray for the healing and peace for all victims and their families, and for an end to violence in all of our communities. Now, it doesn't come as a surprise to me, but some victims' families do not want executions by any means. And they have chosen mercy, and these extensions violate their conscience, and they would like you to hear that. That's what the church is asking us. I've had conversations with our bishops, and when it comes to the abortion issue, they are front and center. They are right there. Thou shalt not kill. Now, they've come out against this one because we can't take it and apply it when it's convenient, or only when the political will is to do something different. Now, it's in the Constitution. We have the death penalty. We know that, but we're going to take it a step further. So let me tell you about another individual who has written. His mother was murdered in December of 2020. I'm sorry, his mother was murdered in the year 2000. The young man who was convicted of his mother's murder has now been on Louisiana's death row for almost 22 years. Killing the young man, and I'm quoting from his note, killing the young man responsible for my mother's death will not bring me or my family any closure. Killing him will only bring into our lives, his family's life, and into our community more pain, more suffering, more anger, and more harm. This is coming from the family. They said, as a victim, I want to be clear that finding alternative and barbaric ways of killing another human being does not represent this family. It goes against their mother's Christian values, and they ask for continued prayers. I'm going to share just one more. I got one from Bishop Cedric Bridgeforth. And he says, Senator, life is a gift and a blessing from our Creator. Life is not ours to take nor to end. Even as the state determines it has the power to end a life, that does not mean it has the right, nor does that make it right. We have power, and how much more powerful is life and love than a damnation and death? I ask you to oppose this legislation. We can do better. We're going to make all the national headlines. We'll be right there. We can do better. No one is going to forget the victims and their suffering. But you heard from a family. They want to be included in the equation. This is not from me, it's from the family. I ask you, I urge you, consider all of the victims and where they are in their struggles. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Boudreaux. Senator Bass for the floor on the bill.
Senators, I rise in support of this bill. At the beginning of the week, I was asked to pray by Senator Barrow. And the first thing that I did, knowing that we would be facing this vote, is I prayed for wisdom. And I've continued to pray for that throughout the week. I've heard others talk about the Bible and what it says. I've heard others that have come here and talk about our God being a God of forgiveness. Praise God, because our God is a God of forgiveness. But it's our sin that separates us from a holy God. In my Bible, it also talks about God being just. And so, as oftentimes when I'm struggling with things, I go to God's Word and try and find out what the true meaning of that is. And as I struggled with this and struggled with what we're faced with today, that's where I went. And I've heard the Bible quoted. I've heard the death penalty being compared to abortion. It's our sin that separates us from a holy God. And an unborn child has committed none. But the people that are on death row that we're talking about have committed some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. And so, as I went to my Bible this week, the word that was given to me sent me to the book of Romans. Specifically, Romans 13, where it talks about God has placed each one of us in the positions we sit in here today. Each one of us. And Romans 13:1 says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Each one of you sit in your seats because God. In the following verses, Romans 13:2, "Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For authorities are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he's God's servant for your good." And it goes on to talk, Romans 13:4, "But if you do wrong," and again, I remind you, we're talking about the most heinous crimes imaginable. "But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." Now, I've heard several debates about the New Testament versus the Old Testament. And I ask you again to think about the victims of the heinous crimes. I think this is very, very clear in the New Testament. But the verse, as I searched for wisdom inside of the Bible this week, it made me be at peace with this, comes from Genesis. And it's Genesis 9:6. And this is what I'll leave you with. "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." I ask that you support this bill.
Thank you, Senator Bass. Senator Bowie for the floor on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I rise in opposition of this bill. And I'm somewhat concerned that the references to Almighty God and His Word have been really, in some instances, misrepresented. Because the one piece that this bill addresses, and while I'm not here to debate the right or wrong of that one, says, "Thou shalt not kill." But more importantly, my opposition for this bill is that what this bill does to our state and our citizens and to our children is to lay a dark cloud of our humanity as human beings, that we would embrace barbaric and draconian methods to do what we think is right based on killing one who has, in fact, killed another. That we would embrace that and say that because of a shortage of a method, we want to create another one, two actually, that have been proven to be barbaric. Many of you have notes that talk about Jewish Louisianans who are concerned about the gassing, the electrocution, how barbaric that is. To the point where individuals who are in the business of both of these methods refuse to sell them. I have one note here where Air Gas Incorporated, the largest distributor of nitrogen in the U.S., has refused to provide nitrogen to Alabama because the use of it is not consistent with their company's values. But we are saying it is consistent with our values and the values we want to lay on our children, that as a state, we would embrace this barbaric method. Also, in Texas, they do not have current phenobarbital for executions because the pharmacists will not dispense it to the Texas Department of Justice. How is it that others who are in the business of making money but understand that the use of this is inhumane, so they refuse to participate? And even what we are saying for those who we are giving the responsibility for carrying out this barbaric act with these barbaric methods, we say we will provide counseling to them. So we recognize there's something abnormal about taking the life, for whatever the reason. But in our humanness, in our capacity as human beings, our intellect and our morality should say to us that yes, if we embrace the death penalty, capital punishment, must we also stoop to embrace such barbaric and inhumane and draconian methods? And so I would ask you members to think about not just yourselves, but think about why we are here. And as leaders of this state, the people who sent us here, what kind of message are we laying and institutionalizing for our children? For that reason, I ask you to propose this bill.
Thank you, Senator Bowie. Senator Lambert for the floor on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, I'm a proponent of the death penalty, and I'm going to tell you something. When I look at school shootings, and I look at when people are targeted by their race or religious beliefs, and we have these mass shooters that come in and wreak havoc on our society and kill people for either their religious beliefs, their race, or whatever reason, they deserve the death penalty. I think our society, we cannot tolerate that kind of action, and it is the appropriate response for those type of instances. I understand the problems that you may have situations where you could have the wrong individual, but in some situations there is the correct individual that is found guilty. And really, he needs to pay the ultimate price. Society cannot tolerate this. We're seeing too much of it, and I think it sends a message that we will not tolerate it. So I stand in favor of this bill.
Thank you, Senator Lambert. Senator Jackson Andrews for the floor.
I said and got confused because I know that if I'm confused and I'm here, the public is confused. Somehow, this has become a debate on whether or not Louisiana should and should not have the death penalty. Senator Boudreaux said it best, I think it was. He said the death penalty is already constitutional in the state of Louisiana. So we're not debating whether an individual who commits murder should be put to death. I have my opinion on it, and I don't support it. But that's not what we're debating today. If this bill fails today, the death penalty would still be law in the state of Louisiana. And I wasn't going to come up, but I thought about it. I said, I think that we're giving the public a bit of confusion, that a vote today means that you're either in favor or not in favor of the death penalty. Today, we debate whether we want to go back to barbaric ways of administering the death penalty. And that's something different. I agree with you on this, Senator Bass. God puts kings up, and he also sits them down. And each of us are here based on the will of God. But Solomon was a king that God had put up. And when his actions became unbecoming of what God believed, he took the tribes away from him. King Saul was put into power in the will of God. But when Saul did not follow his will, God made David king. I say that to say that even though we're placed here by God, every day we're judged by our actions. The Bible says that when the righteous are in power, the people rejoice. And when the wicked in power, the people will mourn. That means that every king that's put up and every senator and House member that's voted on will be judged by his actions. One thing that I know is that one of my most important actions in this building is how I vote. That will dictate whether I'm considered a righteous leader or whether I'm considered a wicked leader. I dare not say that all of us take votes based on our conscience. But then I go to David, who was a king, and he took the husband of Bathsheba's life just because he wanted to be with her. And even then, God found mercy. Not only did he find mercy on David, because David had taken a life, but he called David a man after his own heart, even after the murder. I say that to say I could debate whether the death penalty is right or wrong. And I could search scripture every day, and you're going to find times like with Paul, where he killed Christians just because they were Christians. And he didn't kill one man, not two men, but a multitude of Christians. And because none of us have denied God in this chamber, if Paul would have had his way before becoming Paul, he would have killed each of us just on our profession of Christ. But when he was a changed man, God not only forgave him, but he used him for the kingdom. And a number of us model some of our actions by Paul's former actions after he had killed many. We are not debating whether the death penalty is right or wrong. It's law in Louisiana. What we're debating now is how far we will go to kill a man. That's what we're debating. And what we consider to be humane or inhumane in taking someone's life. See, we can sit on different sides of the death penalty, but agree that some things are just inhumane. And to watch a man suffocate to death by a pill, I consider it inhumane. We've all seen old shows where the gag is in your mouth and that trigger hits for electrocution. You'll tell your kid, turn your face from this, because we don't even want our kids to see the sight of that. We can debate the death penalty on a different day, because regardless of whether this bill passes or not, the death penalty will still be in effect in the state of Louisiana. What we're debating is whether what we don't want our kids to see on TV is what we want others to have to administer. I made my decision because I said I'm not going to ask a Louisianian to do to someone else what I'm not willing to walk in a facility and do myself. That was my idea of a death penalty. Because we can quote scripture all day long. You're going to find times where God took a man's life for what he did, and you're going to find times where they killed multiple. David was a man after God's own heart. Before the murder of Bathsheba's husband and after the murder of Bathsheba's husband. That's not the issue today. The issue is where and how we do it. And whether we just need to reject archaic means of putting people to death. And I came up here just to say that. It seems like we're debating something that's not even on this floor. A man in Louisiana who's on death row will be put to death because the Constitution and our laws say he will. We're debating the manner in which we do it. And as a godly leader, I think at some point, you can't just do what is politically expedient. Because when you do that, you take God out the equation of your decisions. And that's what I think Solomon did. That's what Saul did, and not killing the Amalekites. That's what leaders have done for years. I say to you that our power, if we are sent by God, is not plenary in nature. That we don't get to come and say, God sent us here, and so I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Every day, and I'm not judging anyone as a Christian. We all have our own cross to bear. But this, just because 50% of people elected us and God turned every heart toward us to vote for us, because he did, doesn't mean that we get to do in this body whatever we want. We will be known as righteous or wicked leaders, just like the man in the Bible, based on the decisions and the votes we take. And I'm hoping that at some point, regardless of how this vote goes, we begin to ask God every day, what would you have me to do? But there's no plenary power in any of us. Because when we become absolute power just because we're elected, we stop following God. That's what Solomon did. That's what Saul did. And even when David did it, God saw David's heart and forgave him. And that's the only thing that covers us. That the day we come in here and make a mistake, God covers us. But we're not debating whether a man should be put to death. We're just debating how inhumane we will stand for it to happen.
Thank you, Senator Jackson. Andrews, Senator Cloud for the floor on the bill.
I've really debated members on whether to come up or not, whether just to cast my vote and remain quiet or not. And here I am at the well. I spent time on death row with the death row inmates more than once. I've seen them as people, I've visited with them, I've actually been there. And that's why this vote became confusing for me, and I've really had to search my heart for months because I knew this was coming, this day was coming. And I had to remind myself, and we're living in this world, in this flesh world. I was speaking to Dr. Wheat earlier. We think that this is all that there is to it. But actually, in my opinion, and in my belief as a Christian, this is our training ground for eternity. There's another life for those men that are on death row. And I think I struggled because I want, as a Christian and as a sinner, to know that they had every effort and all the time that they needed, Senator Bass, to repent and be prepared for their eternity. But that's not my business. I'm not in the business of saving people. I'm in the business as a Christian of witnessing to people. Salvation is the Lord's business, and it's within his time that he does his business, not mine. So I'm reminded there's been no stories told on this floor, although there's many victims sitting in the gallery whose lost family members suffered immensely over the consequences of others' actions. And I had forgotten up until today. And so I'm going to give it to the Holy Spirit for reminding me. Many of us have a friend who experienced just this. I won't say her name, and I had permission from her to tell this story. She was a victim of domestic violence. She had three children, and she got away from the man that had severely beat her and threatened her life. She got a divorce. She fled from Dallas to Baton Rouge. This man remarried and had 2 children with his subsequent wife, and he began to beat her. And the 2 little girls, twin little girls, I believe they were 7 years old, witnessed all of that. And she fled. She contacted the police. Protective orders were put in place. He violated protective orders and expressed his extreme love for those 2 little girls. And in a moment of weakness, that mother allowed him one final request, and that was to spend one more afternoon with his 2 little girls. So he picked those 2 little girls up, and he drove to a road, a dead-end road, and he called the mother and told her that she would never get away with what she was doing to him. And he turned around with a gun and shot while the mother listened on the telephone to the 2 little 7-year-olds begging, "No, Daddy, don't. Please don't. There's a book. No, Daddy, don't." And shot those 2 little girls in the head and killed them. I'm a mom. You're a mom. You're a dad, mothers and fathers. The only consolation, had that been me, that I would have for not taking matters into my own hands would be the ultimate consequence found in the death penalty, found in the justice system. It brings order to chaos, and it's necessary. It's uncomfortable, and we have to search our hearts. But it is necessary in a fallen world. God is the one who instituted the death penalty. God is a God of love. He's so loving. I'm a sinner. We all are. Yet he still chose this because he knew that it would be the ultimate deterrent to those who would sin and destroy the lives of others. The death penalty is the ultimate consequence for the most egregious. It's the worst of the worst consequence for the worst of the worst crime. It's not with an easy heart and an easy vote, but it is necessary for me to cast this vote. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Senator Cloud. Senator Luna for the floor on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I rise in opposition to this bill. You know, you realize the importance of a debate you're having by the level of noise in this building. And as I sit there this morning, we started the debate, and one of my colleagues walked behind me. I could count every footstep That's how quiet it was in here. And the reason for that is because this issue is that important. Now, make no mistake about it. Senator Andrews is correct. This is not about whether or not we have the death penalty in Louisiana. We have the death penalty in Louisiana. This is about the type of ways that we administer the death penalty in Louisiana. Now, we've heard lots of debate coming up to this moment. We've heard lots of political fodder coming up to this moment. And we've heard a lot of personal stories. But understand something. There's more than one side to a personal story, because we know that some people want vengeance. And I get it. I can't say here truthfully today that I wouldn't seek vengeance if it happened to someone that was that close to me. And I don't claim to be a biblical scholar, but I do know that in the Bible that I read, in those red words, it says that vengeance belongs to the Lord, not to man. Now let's talk for just a moment about these families that don't want vengeance, because there are a lot of them, and we've heard from them too. Do we ignore their wishes? Do we just say, forget about what they want? It doesn't matter if it's on their conscience that another person has lost their life because of them? Those are hard decisions. Those are decisions we have to make, but I respect both sides of that argument. I don't think the opinions of the people that have lost a loved one and don't want the death penalty carried out, I don't think those opinions should be ignored. But I can tell you this, in my estimation, there's nothing more daunting than ending a human life. And the stories are horrific. I get it. And whether that ending of the human life is with a bullet or with gas or some kind of poison that's injected into them, it all spells the same thing. It's the end of a human life. And we have to answer to that because we make those decisions. It is uncontradicted that the death penalty is not a deterrent to crime. There have been empirical studies since we've had executions on that for years and years and years. The numbers do not support that notion. So what are we doing? Well, when life's over, I believe that your suffering ends. And I think some of these people that we would put to death, their suffering's going to end. But if they're kept in jail for the rest of their life, their suffering doesn't end. For those of us who have been to death row, have been to Angol, and seen people that are going to be there for the rest of their life, it's a lot of suffering. Not that it's not deserved and earned, but that's just the truth of the matter. They suffer. It's not like they get off scot-free without any punishment. But I think the one thing that I keep coming back to time and time again is, do I want on my conscience the fact that we execute one innocent person? And we've executed a lot of innocent people, and we know that now. And for that reason, I do not support this bill.
Thank you, Senator Luno. Senator Kleinpeter? I see no more questions. Senator Kleinpeter to close on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President, members. I've watched all the testimonies and debates on the House side, and I have the privilege to serve on Jude C Committee, where we've had the opportunity to listen to testimonies of the families of those who were murdered, and I commend them for having so much courage to come testify. We also had to sit and listen to those who advocate for those who have committed some of the most heinous crimes, and while being put to death, they suffered. How the man who recently was executed in Alabama by nitrogen hypoxia suffered, but they didn't want to talk about how he was a hired hitman that planned out a murder and he brutally beat and stabbed a woman to death. I can't imagine what those family members felt in committee listening to that over and over. Like Mrs. Dana, who in 1995 was carjacked. She was shot 4 times along with her 11-month-old son, Etienne. I'll hold up a picture for y'all to see. He passed away 2 days later in her arms. That killer had also shot and killed someone the day before over a single dollar bill. He's still alive on death row. Or like the family of Trooper Stephen Vincent, who served his country in the Army and as well as a state trooper. He died in the line of duty, leaving behind a grieving wife and a 9-year-old son. Trooper Vincent was attempting to help a motorist on the side of the road when he was shot in the head with a sawed-off shotgun. That man stood over him, telling him he was going to die, and he's still alive on death row. Or like the Gazzardos, who their beautiful daughter Stephanie was murdered in 1995 while begging for her life. I want to say that again. The year was 1995, and the convicted killer has exhausted all appeals, yet he still lives to this day on death row. I've questioned if I should even bring this next one up because it hits home a lot to all of us in this room. As I sat in my living room this morning preparing for this bill, my 4-year-old son woke up, and he came and sat on my lap, asking me little innocent questions, and I couldn't help myself but to think about Wesley Allen Mercer, who in 1988, he had an accident at school and soiled himself, and he came home, and his stepfather, out of anger, beat him in the head with a screwdriver over and over until he was unconscious and threw him in a hot boiling water. He's still alive on death row. These are just a few stories that when the appeal delays are ruled on and when the time to honor the commitment has come, nothing happens. Let me be clear. Don't let your judgment be clouded today. I want to remind you all that we are not here to create the law of the death penalty. It's already the law of the land. We're here to expand the law to include other legal methods of execution, as well as to protect those involved with the lethal injection process. We made an oath to uphold the laws of our state. Members, I want you to take a moment and look up above. We have family members of the victims of murderers. I don't know all their names and I don't know all of their stories, but they have a lot of courage to come here today, and I thank y'all for coming to support us on this bill. I just wish all these victims had the same time to say goodbye to their loved ones or to choose their last meal before their life was cut short due to murder. Today, we can honor these families and remove the hurdles so that justice may be served for the victims. Mr. President and members, I ask that you support me and the families of the victims, and I ask for final passage of House Bill 6 today.
Thank you, Senator Klein-Peter. Senator Klein-Peter moves final passage on House Bill number 6. When the machines are open, all those in favor vote yea, all opposed vote nay. Madam Secretary, please open the machines. Vote your machine, members. Vote your machines. You through voting? Secretary will close the machine. 24 yeas and 15 nays, and then the bill is finally passed. Senator Klein-Peter moves to consider the vote by which that bill passed and lay that motion on the table without objection. Members, at this time, I would like to welcome Governor Landry to the chamber. He's up in the balcony behind you. Thank you for joining us, Governor.